Good evening and welcome to Newsfirst's BIZ in Focus. I'm Zinat Musafir. Joining us this evening is Anita Varusavitaruna, a research analyst at the Advocata Institute, the economic think tank based in Colombo. Good evening, Anita.
Good evening.
So, Anita, last week the government, particularly the Ministry of Finance, said that they will rectify pension anomalies of approximately 500,000 pensioners. So first things first, what do they mean by these pension anomalies?
So essentially what's happening there is that these pensioners have fallen under two different circulars, and that has meant that they get different pension benefits. So in order to standardize across the board, the Ministry of Finance in the budget speech also mentioned that they will be providing extra funds through the budget to rectify these anomalies.
Okay, so what do they mean by rectify these anomalies? What are the measures that the government proposes to rectify these anomalies?
It's essentially a payout to these pensioners to make sure that across the board that the pensioners get an equal pension benefit. However, I feel like that is a small component of a larger problem, which is the pension payouts in general.
Yeah.
Right now, the central bank puts, as of 2018, the yearly expenditure at 194 billion rupees, which is approximately 9.3% of recurrent expenditure.
Okay.
This is the amount that goes out every year to pay pension benefits.
Okay.
And that is a number we need to kind of interrogate and see as to whether this payment is something that the government should be taking on, and if it is in the role of the government to take it on.
So, Anita, when it comes to EPF or the ETF, so generally how it works is the employer as well as the employee contributes a certain a certain portion of their salaries, and so that's how it works. But then when it comes to the pension scheme, how does this system work?
So when it comes to the pension scheme, it's a completely unfunded, non-contributory system. This means that at the point of retirement, the government will provide its pensioners with about between 83 to 88% of their final salary up until point of death, which is a large amount of money that goes out. So right now, looking at the number of pensioners we have presently, that's about 3%, less than 3% of the population, and every year about 10% of our recurrent expenditure goes for these pension payments, and these payments are only going to balloon in the future.
Yeah.
And the reason why the payments are so high is precisely as you mentioned, because it is not contributory. Under a private sector scheme, what would happen is, like as you see with EPF, ETF, an employer puts in X amount, an employee puts in X amount, and there is a bit of give and take in that system, and both people commit to that. Whereas in the case of the government's pension scheme, it is completely non-contributory.
So in 2016, after the Yahapalne government came into power, they said that those who join the government sector as employees, they will be falling into a different pension scheme. So does that mean that before 2016, they will be a part of the non-contributory pension scheme, and after 2016, it will be a contributory pension scheme?
So there's actually, it's all a bit uncertain. Okay. So what happened was, I believe the government recognized that this is a large commitment financially, and it is not a sustainable system to continue. So as of 2016, the 1st of January, all individuals hired into the government service don't fall under this non-contributory pension scheme. However, it is not specified as to what scheme they will fall under. So there is this worry, there is this fear that the government can just decide that these people will also fall under.
They need to be straightforward in that sense. They haven't made a proper announcement.
They haven't made a proper announcement. They haven't specified what sort of pension entitlement these people will be eligible to. And if it is, this is also an opportunity. The government can make it a contributory pension scheme. But if they choose not to, then the pension commitments that the Treasury will have to meet every year will simply grow.
Yes, and I remember that this was something that was highlighted by the World Bank as well.
Yes.
The impact on the economy as well as the treasury. So you spoke of how the pension is not contributory,
Yes.
but it's an outflow from the government treasury. So could you tell me, apart from the outflow, which of course is definitely a negative impact on any economy, apart from the outflow, is there any other impact that could sort of an adverse impact?
So, I mean, when you look at the role of the government and what
Yeah.
it should be doing,
Yeah.
it is sometimes difficult to say that, oh, we want to scrap the pension scheme, because when you say pensions, you think of your grandparents and the fact that they now have income in their old age to pay for medical bills, etc., etc. And it is, in theory, a very nice concept. However, you have if a government is acting as an employer, and in this case it has to think in the same way a private sector employer would too. No private sector organization would agree to paying pension benefits completely unfunded without the employee putting something in.
Yeah.
And it is even the government has a greater responsibility, because in the case of a private sector organization, it would be profits that they're using, and then it's their money. If they wish to be supremely benevolent and give this unfunded, non-contributory system, it would be fine. But in this case, it's taxpayers' money, and it's taxpayers' money in a country in which, I mean, our economic situation isn't too great. We have
So much of debt we have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, with our repayment, we have to meet these repayment commitments. And in light of that, and in light of the fact that we are essentially a country that has the economic situation of a developing country, but the demographics of a developed country, the government needs to think of a more sustainable way to manage this problem.
Yes. And talking of demography, Anita, so according to World Bank statistics as well as central bank statistics, our demography is changing. Our aging population, it's increasing. So do you think that the current mechanisms in place, not just pension, but other security mechanisms, are sufficient to address this aging population, the growth in the aging population?
So quite frankly, no. I'd like to answer that question in two parts. The first is that yes, we have, in terms of demographic change, we are coming into a rapidly aging population, where at the end of our demographic dividend, and by around, the World Bank estimates that by around 2050, we're going to have more elderly than we have youth. And that essentially means that when you look at your dependency ratios, the number of people who will be dependent on you, both children and elderly, on the working age population, that's going to be skewed not in favor of those who are working. It means that the people in between the ages of, like, say 20 to 50, while they're working, they're going to have to not only support themselves, they're also going to have to support two sets of dependents. And that puts a huge burden on personal finances as well as on the economy. And that is something that the government has to consider.
Yes.
And then when you think of coverage, what the government needs to be doing in terms of addressing this problem or this situation of an aging population, if our elderly population is going to boom in the way that numbers say it will, then this pension scheme is not the sustainable way to address it.
Yeah.
Every year, if right now, if in 2018 we spent if in 2018 we spent 10% of government recurrent expenditure for only 3% of the population.
Just on
the
pensioners.
pensions, and
Okay.
it only affected 3% of the population.
Yeah.
There is an entire sector of section of informal sector workers as well as private sector workers who aren't necessarily financially stable and able to manage their old age.
Yeah. So basically the government needs to put in place a proper mechanism in terms of the pension scheme.
So I would be hesitant to say proper mechanism.
Okay.
They have promised a national pension scheme in the budget. However, when you see what has happened with this current pension scheme and the financial situation that the country is in, maybe the government should be thinking of playing more the role of a regulator and a facilitator, as opposed to being a provider of pension benefits or a complete provider of old age security. It could simply be addressing why we have such a large informal sector, looking at how you can make it easier for businesses to formalize and make it easier for employers to provide certain old age security benefits.
Thank you, Anita. And with that, we're going in for a short commercial break. Do stay tuned for more on the other side. Welcome back to BIZ in Focus. Joining us this evening is Anita Varusavitaruna, a research analyst at the Advocata Institute. Now, we were talking, Anita, about the pension scheme. Now, with regard to the pension scheme or the pension mechanism in the local context, what are the main drawbacks you see, especially when compared with the international pension systems or equivalent systems in place in other countries?
So what you see is that Sri Lanka offers a very it offers a very generous pension scheme, and while that sounds good, in reality it's quite a burden on the economy, as we discussed earlier. And importantly, when you look at international examples, when you look at the OECD countries, their pension, like the replacement rate, essentially how much of your last salary will you get for during your retirement, the average is about 58%. As opposed to our average, which ranges between 83 and 88%. That's a huge gap, and that gap is an indication that maybe we need to rethink our pension scheme and rethink the types of kind of benefits that we're giving.
Yes. Because ultimately it affects the treasury and the taxpayer.
Taxpayers' money. At the end of the day, it's taxpayers' money. And in the situation that we are in right now, where we have mounting debt to pay over the next 5 years, and we're struggling to increase our tax base, you have to. I feel like the government should be weighing its role in this position and what it can do to address the problem.
Okay. So Anita, before you mentioned that ideally the government should try to, while introduce a proper mechanism, also should try to step away from the role it plays when it comes to pensions and the pension system. So what do you propose? Do you think that for the state sector employees, another mechanism similar to EPF and ETF should be introduced?
So I think there are a couple of possible reforms.
Okay.
The first is that there's a little room for the government to take action and do something about the current pension and benefits that they have to pay over the next 30 years. These are simple reforms, and understanding that people would have planned their retirements expecting this money to come in, the government should be responsible, and you have to kind of give people some room to manage their finances.
Yeah.
So these are reforms that you would ideally introduce to younger cohorts, so people maybe in their 20s and 30s, so that then they can plan their retirement appropriately. But it would be small measures, simply like indexing pensions to the consumer price index, so that the government doesn't have to make these large payoffs as they are doing now to adjust the anomalies, and the Treasury doesn't have to face that burden. And another simple measure that could be done is to increase the retirement age. People work longer all around the world, and given Sri Lanka's high life expectancy, it's great, and people do stay on in work. So the government could simply increase its retirement age so that the pension burden isn't as high. But to address the second part of your question, where you spoke about whether an EPF, ETF kind of system would be what we should think about, well, quite frankly, yes. The government has promised a national pension plan in this year's budget, and this is an opportunity for the government to really make sure that when they commit to pension payments and when they address the problem not the problem of the elderly, but the growing aged population, that it does so in a sustainable way. A system like EPF, ETF is something that could be replicated, where there is a contribution that comes in. However, if the government is to really think in terms of sustainability, it should make it very clear that this pension is something to maybe supplement retirement, and make sure that to give a sort of safety net, but it shouldn't be the single source of income for an elderly person.
Yeah.
It has been in the past, and it has helped a lot of people for sure. However, you have to think of, because there will always be a give and take. So the government could give you a great pension entitlement that you can live on, and you don't have to lift a finger after you retire, and you don't need to think of saving or investing your money. But that money has to come from somewhere, and it comes from taxpayers' money, and you yourself are a taxpayer. It will mean that the government will have to widen its tax base. It will have to increase the taxes that it gives on people.
So it will affect future tax rates as well?
It will definitely affect future tax rates, or it will mean that the government will have to borrow heavily, and those borrowings will have to be financed.
Yes.
The money, it's always very nice to think that the government is going to give you a pension, or it's going to give you this old age security, but the money comes from somewhere, and quite often it actually comes from you. So
it comes from the taxpayer. So the taxpayer is the one who pays at last.
Yes.
So apart from that, Anita, now there are the current pension beneficiaries. So what sort of measures do you propose to address whatever the issues that may arise in the future with regard to the current pension beneficiaries?
With the current pension beneficiaries, as I mentioned earlier, a commitment has been made, so the government can't really step away from that. It can increase the retirement age, it can index pensions to the CPI. It can also, so right now, pension entitlements are calculated based on your final salary, the last year of work. But international experience has shown us that maybe a better way to go about it is to calculate your pension entitlement based on your best 5 years. So you take an average as opposed to that last final year, which makes it a bit more sustainable.
Okay. Yeah. And with that, we're going in for a short commercial break. Do stay tuned for more on the other side. Welcome back to BIZ in Focus. Joining us this evening is Anita Varusavitarana, a research analyst at the Advocata Institute, the economic think tank based in Colombo. Anita, we were talking about the pension scheme in Sri Lanka, we were talking about the anomalies, and of course what sort of measures can be taken to address the issues regarding the pension scheme. Now, what sort of we were talking about demography, we were talking about the youth population as well as the elderly population. Now, with regard to the youth population, youngsters, they sort of have this tendency to, they're always attracted to the state, the government sector, when compared with the private sector. I guess the main reason is because of the pension benefit that they will receive after they retire. So, could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's common knowledge that a majority of young graduates would prefer to work in the government than to work in the private sector. And while it's difficult to give one single reason for this preference, a component of that is definitely the pension benefit that one gets. We have spoken extensively how this pension is unsustainable, but more importantly, thinking of it from the perspective of a young graduate who is hopefully aspirational and wants to have a nice career and have a nice life. If you entering into the government sector, when you have a pension scheme like the one we have right now, it completely disincentivizes you to move jobs. If you enter in, you have to stay there for a minimum of 10 to 15 years. And as far as we can see by precedent, people don't move out of government once they enter in and start moving up the ladder. And if they were to introduce some flexibility into the pension scheme, where if you do leave after 5 years, you don't lose your entire pension entitlement. You lose a component of it for sure, because you are not working after that point for the government, but to provide flexibility so that people can move in between private sector and government sector and have that knowledge transfer, have that skill transfer that's happening. Because right now it's very difficult to entice people away from the government sector into the private sector, where there are jobs waiting for people.
Yes. And apart from that, so you spoke before about the government stepping away from handling the pension scheme. What sort of a role would you see the government playing as a facilitator for this pension scheme?
So I see the government's role as being one where it really looks at the problem of aging holistically. It would need to consider things like geriatric medicine or access for the elderly, etc., etc. But one large component of that would be how do these people finance their retirement, and incentivizing people to save and think for the future, improving financial literacy in this country. Financial literacy is extremely low. I believe it's in the 30s. I might be wrong though. But we need to allow people to be able to get jobs that will pay them well enough for them to be able to save and work and retire and live a nice life. Yeah. Because we don't see the government, when the government gives out samurdhi benefits or when the government gives out a pension, yes, it is great, but it is not this complete blanket that will ensure complete security. It's not going to happen. And a bigger problem that the government should be looking at, and maybe private sector could be looking at it too, is the fact that simply because when you look at our demographics, women live far longer than men. Life expectancy for men is around 72 years, and for women it's about 78 years. So what we will see in the future is this feminization of old age, where there will be this large cohort of elderly women who might be living alone depending on family structures, but they will be entirely dependent on someone else. And the reason for that goes back to female labor force participation. It's very low. It's around 36%. And if you don't work, you have no opportunity, you have no ability to save for your future. Yes. So if the government is going to think of sustainable ways to make sure that the elderly population of this country is financially stable in their retirement, they should be looking at improving conditions in the labor market. They should be easing regulations, making it easier for women to enter the market, taking steps to accommodate things like childbirth and child care, and making sure that burden is shared somewhat equally, so that we would have more women entering the market and therefore being able to earn and being able to save and being able to finance for their retirement. And of course it works across genders. Increasing labor market, reducing rigidity in the labor market and making sure people can enter and work would be a huge step the government can take in its role as a facilitator that would create opportunity for people to finance themselves in their retirement in a sustainable manner.
Okay, thank you, Anita. And with that, we wrap BIZ in Focus. Joining us this evening was Anita Varusavitharana, Research Analyst at the Advocata Institute based in Colombo. Thank you once again, Anita, and hope to see you again on our program in the future. Thank you for watching. Good night.